Welcome to Atlas Live, Atlas Public Policy's live video podcast that brings together industry and policy leaders for lively discussions on the future of clean technology, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, climate change, and more.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Atlas Live. We're going to be talking about states that are taking the lead on clean trucks. Before we get our guests here introduced, we're actually going to have a short intro by my colleague, Ben Sharp, who's going to talk a little bit about some program design priorities. And then we'll jump into a conversation with Alissa Burger, Morgan Ellis, and myself, Rachael Nealer. So, Ben, take it away.
Hi, my name is Ben, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. I want to take a couple minutes to share some recent work on how states can design more effective incentive programs for electric medium and heavy-duty vehicle charging infrastructure. Electric trucks are growing fast. U.S. sales were about 75,000 in 2025, but the charging infrastructure they need is costly, complex, and still early stage. State incentive programs can play a critical role in helping commercial fleets make the leap, but only if those programs are well designed. To understand what well-designed actually looks like in practice, we spoke with 16 stakeholders about their on-the-ground experiences. These included state government agency staff, EV charging providers, fleet operators, and policy experts. 5 design priorities emerged clearly from these conversations. First, flexible. Programs need to accommodate the enormous variety of commercial fleets, different vehicle types, business models, and operational needs, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach. Second, coordinated. Vehicle and infrastructure funding should be synchronized so projects don't stall, and utilities need to be brought in early to navigate grid planning challenges. Third, streamlined. Administrative complexity is one of the biggest barriers to participation, especially for smaller fleets that don't have dedicated staff to manage grant applications. Fourth, accessible. Equity goals need to be built in from the start, with specific design elements and tracking, not added as an afterthought. And fifth, sustainable. Programs need stable, dedicated funding streams and built-in flexibility to evolve as the market matures. These priorities aren't just ideals, they reflect real barriers and real solutions that practitioners are experiencing right now. We hope this work helps policymakers design programs that actually move the needle on commercial fleet electrification. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ben, for the overview. We have that report also available on our website. So if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check it out at atlaspolicy.com. All right. I am so excited today to be joined by my colleagues, Alissa Burger and Morgan Ellis. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we'll get started into this conversation. So I'm Rachael Nealer. I'm a director here at Atlas Public Policy. And I will first introduce my friend here, Morgan Ellis, who's at Maryland Department of Transportation as the director of electric vehicles, climate change, and air quality. And the fun fact between Morgan and I is that we both used to work at the Department of Energy together. Welcome, Morgan. Thanks for joining. Could you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what gets you excited about medium and heavy duty vehicles?
Absolutely. First, thank you, Rachael, for inviting me to the podcast live today. It's a pleasure to be here. Also to the audience, happy Earth Day. Yes. And to Atlas, also happy birthday, right? Thank you. So big day. Again, Morgan Ellis, Maryland DOT. What gets me excited about medium and heavy duty vehicles? Well, when you first asked me that question, honestly, the first thing I thought about was the city bus. And being on an electric bus, we have multiple electric buses in our fleet at the Maryland Transit Administration. The quiet, the soothing, the stream, it's just a pleasant ride. You think about the sounds of the city, but when you're on that bus, it's just calm and quiet. Exactly. Almost zen-like. So I think that was the first thing that popped into my head when thinking about medium and heavy duty vehicles.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. Excited to jump into the conversation shortly, but let's introduce our other colleague, Alissa Burger from CalSTART. So she is the Regional Policy Director at CalSTART. And the fun fact about Alissa and I is that we both went to Carnegie Mellon University and have both lived in Pittsburgh, where she joins us today. Alissa, could you please introduce yourself and tell us what gets you excited about medium and heavy duty vehicles?
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And yes, Pittsburgh's having a big week. In addition to this podcast, the NFL draft starts, I think, in a day or two from Pittsburgh. So Atlas is on top of it. I am the Regional Policy Director for CalSTART. CalSTART is a national nonprofit working on clean energy solutions, everything from bikes to big rigs, really focusing on zero emission technologies, battery electric, hydrogen. And we also have an international program under our Drive to Zero name, which is working with countries on kind of similar goals around accelerating zero emission vans and trucks, as well as, of course, passenger vehicles and buses. So CalSTART's been around for about 30 years, starting in Southern California, and we've grown quite a bit, now staff all over the country. We work with, I would say, all states, some more closely than others, but it's been really exciting to be a part of the team when under the Biden administration, from the bipartisan infrastructure law and IIJA, we just saw so much investment coming into zero emission vehicle space, as particularly in that medium and heavy duty category as well. So in terms of what makes me the most excited, which in addition to being quiet, it's just, we have fewer vans, trucks, buses on the roads, but they have an outsized impact in terms of, air quality. And so every time I see a zero emission van in and around my neighborhood doing a delivery, it's just great to know that it can idle as long as it wants while it drops off those boxes. It's quiet, it's pollution free. And so I think working in this particular sector, class 2B through 8, gives us an opportunity to really kind of go after a high percentage of market acceleration and really see some fantastic impacts, be it economic development, air quality improvements, or decarbonization.
Really great point, Alissa. Thank you for that. And the areas that the air quality impacts affect, especially around ports and airports, it's really, really great to be able to have clean energy, clean transportation solutions for those areas, for the local and greenhouse gas emission impacts. So you've done a great job, Alissa, already kind of segueing us into the current state of medium and heavy duty electrification. But would love to hear, Morgan, some more from you about where you're seeing real momentum today. As Ben mentioned, there are key vehicle segments, duty cycles, and use cases. So when we talk about medium and heavy duty vehicles, it's really a broad spectrum of vehicles. And so where are we seeing some momentum and some progress in electrification?
Sure. Happy to jump in a little bit, what we're seeing in Maryland, both in the public side and also with our private fleets. On the public side, the Maryland Department of Transportation, has been working through our modal administrations with our port administration. We've got a clean ports program that was funded through the EPA, really will revolutionize the vehicles and the grid and the charging that's available at the port. Huge deal. Our transit administration, just to shout out to them again, really putting their steps forward and securing zero emission buses and the charging infrastructure. And a lot of those routes are in places like Baltimore, where air pollution really can be it can be great with all the traffic. So those routes are now cleaner. And then, thinking about MDOT as a whole, with our partners, our modal administration, State Highway, working through the Clean Corridors Coalition. That is funded through the EPA under the Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant, a partnership from Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland to really help spur momentum with medium and heavy duty charging along the 95 corridor. In Maryland, we will receive approximately $76 million for up to 8 sites, 150 ports that would be directly available to medium and heavy duty charging. That's a game changer. Our partners at the Department of Environment have put out a medium and heavy duty truck assessment, really trying to understand what's needed with our grid investment. Our partners at MEA trying to roll out grants. They've given upwards of 10 million for 93 vehicles in the short time that that program's been available for electrification. So Maryland is really taking, I think, and embracing an ecosystems approach because each department holds a part of the solution. And so it's been really our goal to connect the dots and to build that ecosystem so we can continue the further deployment of those vehicles.
I love that. I love that. And the Clean Corridors program is just one to highlight. Alice also participates in that along with Math Tech and Cadmus Group, supporting the states through that regional effort, which I think could hopefully be something that we could replicate in the future because, as Ben mentioned, having coordinated efforts, regional efforts for electrification are really important.
Mhm.
Alissa, anything from the national perspective that you'd want to add to the kind of where we are and where we're seeing momentum in electrification?
Yeah, so I first want to just build off of something Morgan said, and then I'll kind of turn to what we're seeing in terms of national trends. Morgan kind of mentioned the word ecosystem, and I think that's really the most important takeaway when we're talking about building a mature market. So, and Maryland is doing a lot of these things in terms of setting targets, getting plans out, looking at different economic development components in terms of sales tax exemptions, those sorts of things, and then offering incentives, which I know we'll do a deeper dive on. And then it keeps going in terms of innovative policy, utility planning for infrastructure. So it's really all of the above as we see private investment come into the states, which is absolutely continuing despite some changes at the federal level. In terms of kind of what CalSTART is seeing and what's happening at the national level, this is happening all over the country. Every state has medium and heavy duty vehicles deployed at this point. And it's really being driven by the business case in terms of making sense for fleets. In terms of the types of vehicles, we're seeing cargo vans leading by cumulative deployments, but then yard tractors are also, they have a pretty sizable deployment share. And with both of these types of vehicles, it's really working because it's an ideal duty cycle compatibility, lower upfront cost deltas, and then easier infrastructure processes to navigate, which Ben sort of touched on in his video. So, I think that we're kind of seeing how with each passing year, improvements in technology as well as state and federal support meeting cost parity. And again, this is very dependent on duty cycle, et cetera. We can dive into some of that, but the market is really taking off.
Maybe looking at this from a slightly different perspective, that was a great summary of kind of the vehicle side, Alissa. What about charging? What are we seeing for charging across states, across the national strategy? It's going to be very different than light duty vehicle charging. We're talking about multi megawatt stations. So what are you seeing on the charging side? I think, Morgan, you already mentioned a little bit of some public investment in charging. What's happening in Maryland?
So it's, when I think about the intersection of the vehicles and the charging in Maryland, when I reached out, I did reach out to the Maryland Trucking Association and was like, hey, what's going on? Tell me about the fleets. And one piece of feedback that I got was there is a lot of interest. Fleets are piloting not just the vehicles, but charging. And there's lessons learned coming in from that. So, some logistics companies that are out and back to and from the port, they're charging not, I won't say low and slow, but at a steady, slower charge, not DC fast charging. And that is appearing to work as goods are being moved on and off the vehicle. So that's been a positive. I will also say there were some flags with challenges. Landlord lease agreements. Often these logistics companies are not owned by the fleet. So trying to work through some of those challenges. But then also, I believe in Maryland, some of the communications, there's still a long way to go, but the communications between the utilities and the fleets is getting better. Um, more room to grow, but there's more of a cadence of this takes time. We need to make sure you're in the queue. What does your duty cycle look like? How do we right size to make sure the grid and the and your needs are balanced? So again, maybe in the start of those conversations, but they're growing. And there's an appetite to have more of those conversations, not just across the state, but the fleets and our utilities.
That's great. That's really great. Alissa, anything on charging you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, so the needs are very different. At the same time, I think sometimes what's happening is it can seem very overwhelming. So sometimes the rhetoric seems to be, well, we're not there yet, so let's not start at all. And I think that's absolutely kind of like the wrong assumption or takeaway. The first thing is in terms of, duty cycles and how these last mile delivery vans are traveling. Most of them are returning back to the same place they started at night. So they can be charging there, as Morgan mentioned, kind of low and slow through the evening and ready for the next day. That's kind of a great example of how I would say that, that makes sense in terms of utilization. And we're not really talking about then the class 7 and the class 8 long haul. I think also in terms of for utilities as well as charging as service providers and fleets, that's why planning is so important. Trucks have been moving goods in this country for a very long time. We have a lot of data on freight flow and how things are moving across the country along which interstates. And so really pairing that information with then the states that they run through, the utilities, and figuring out, okay, these are probably like no regret areas to start thinking about higher wattage charging, megawatt charging, those sorts of things, and it can be phased in. So, I think also under the Biden administration, a freight kind of plan was released that really talked about that approach. It doesn't have to be done all at once because that's really not what's happening. We're talking about the last mile delivery vehicles right now that are reaching cost parity, that can do the level 2 charging overnight, that the utilities are kind of more comfortable and able to interconnect with. And then at the same time and in parallel, we need to start getting ready now for those larger classes of vehicles, the faster charging. So I think, if you're talking to EEI or EPRI, the first thing they're going to say is like, it's never too early to talk to your utility. And that's 1,000% right. There's also a role I think public utility commissions need to play, are playing, and can be playing a bigger part in terms of proactive planning, transportation electrification planning investments. If we have time for that, we can get into it. So, it's really a lot of cooks in the kitchen are needed, and everybody has a role to play.
Funny that you say that because I think just this week I heard literally Britta Gross from EPRI say, go to your utility early and often. And I do think that we are learning that lesson now that we've had a lot more experience deploying charging across the country. We know that loads can't be delivered right away on the timelines that transportation typically operates. And so how, especially for very large loads like medium and heavy duty, I also would like to hit on, I think it's really great to talk about the different charging strategies too. There's en route charging, there's return to base charging, there's potentially even residential charging. So we have some forthcoming research coming out soon that kind of looks at lots of those different types of strategies for different vehicles and their use cases. And then we also participated in, Ben actually did some work with the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, looking at their data for electric vehicles, and has a forthcoming publication as well, really analyzing how trucks are charging now, and it's very different. It's very different depending on the use case of the vehicle. So not only do we have to figure out how to electrify the vehicle, but then we also have to figure out how to match the charging. I think that's really interesting that it seems like the lower, slower charging is actually going to be a really great solution for many applications, which I think is then great for the grid too,
Yeah.
right? We don't want to have lots of fast charging, dynamic charging, especially at the megawatt level happening on the grid, because our grid
Yeah.
is not built for that type of dynamic load. So maybe going into utilities a little bit more, can you tell me what that utility coordination looks like? It's early and often, but where have you seen kind of successes? And maybe this time I'll start with
Yeah.
Alissa at the national level.
Yeah, I mean, with the investor-owned utilities, obviously they're under the purview of a state's public utility commission, and so it has really differed state to state. I think, in states like California, we're seeing a lot of progress in terms of thinking about things like flexible interconnection, proactive planning. I think some of that is also happening in Colorado under Excel. And then, we have some of it going on in the East Coast, and there's a variety of dockets that speak to these issues. I think that, electrons don't stop at a state border. Trucks, don't either, depending on their route. And so what I love to see about the project that Morgan mentioned is states really do need to be working together. And I think that then utilities working across state lines as well. I think there's been a little bit of hesitancy over the past decade, if not more, for public utility commissions to really want to get into the transportation electrification space, to be approving those upfront investments that are really critically needed. And so I do hope that mindset is starting to change, be it, at NARUC and other places. Ultimately, these vehicles can be a distributed energy resource. So along with batteries and other things, it's like, how does this all fit together at the grid level? And I think where utilities have been granted permission, they're doing a lot of great work in terms of planning, National Grid, in Con Ed and New York. So, I think we're seeing some good examples everywhere. But again, what I think makes it challenging for the market, different fleets that are operating all over the country, national companies, is that if it's one way in the Northeast and it's another way in the Southwest, that does make it difficult. That's a lot of rules to understand, different processes. And so going again back to what Ben said, I think to the extent that we can streamline and make consistent how utilities are approaching battery electric vehicles, particularly those of the larger sizes, the better off we're going to be. That being said, it's a newer technology, and so there are considerations, going into that in terms of we don't want stranded assets. But I'm hoping that fleets do want this, as we're hearing, as Morgan's talking about. And so I do hope that utilities become a little more kind of bullish in playing in the medium and heavy duty zero emission space.
There's over 3,300 utilities to work with across the country and across 52 states and territories. So that's a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different organizations, processes. So you've touched very much on many of the kind of conclusions in our recent report at Atlas on energization timelines, where we actually took a little bit of a different perspective of the energization timelines. Instead of saying, you can reduce it by 6 months or 18 months, it actually puts a cost to that.
Right.
And says for each station, if you are able to reduce the timelines by 6 months or 18 months, where are kind of two scenarios for light duty and medium and heavy duty stations, you are able to actually have a net present value cost savings of $104,000 to $165,000 per station for light duty vehicles, and $1.8 to $3.4 million per station for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I mean, medium
Those are-
heavy duty vehicle stations are very costly to
Right.
begin with. So while that price tag sounds very high, it is a portion of the overall site. But you're not only getting accelerated revenue, but you're avoiding delays and costly delays. And then you're also potentially improving the air quality much faster.
Yeah.
You have some air quality benefits
Right.
as well. So
Yeah.
anything else to share from Maryland perspective on maybe some successes of utility coordination?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, let me say my utility partners, if they've logged on or they'll watch this, they are smiling. They are happy to hear that we are talking about coordination. Our fleet partners are also, grinning because this is so important. Going back to what Ben said, coordination. I think I'm going to hit on that just because there's some really good local examples and some strategies that I chatted with utilities about. Tell me about, what can I say on this podcast? And not that it's not just, well, it's going to be 12 to 18 months for energization. Okay. I think that, we can all kind of understand that. But, one thing they did say that is beneficial to them, channeling Britta Gross, act early, act often, come and talk to us. Tell us about your plans. Tell us about where you're located. Measure twice, cut once. And some of those strategies were even telling and describing duty cycles, the needs of your vehicles, what you do, and working in partnership and in tandem to right size the facility and the chargers that are needed. Because, I think there's often the equation, well, I need this to be filled up in 5 minutes. And moving megawatts is very costly, and understanding the duty cycle and what your needs are. Going back to Alissa, if it's a spoken hub fleet, they're coming home, let's have a conversation. So the coordination was absolutely key. What my utilities were saying to me, they were saying, help us make sure that you're getting the best bang for your buck. We can help you right size, drive down cost. We can help you understand your utility bill. There's been some examples in Maryland where fleets have done electrification. They got hit with some peak charges. Oh my gosh, and that really doesn't spur a lot of willingness to continue to electrify. And so the utilities in Maryland want to be seen as a resource. And that was one message that they brought back to me, or told me to emphasize: right size. Let us be a resource. Let us walk you through things. Let us be a partner at the start, not after vehicles and chargers have been purchased. Let us help you. And so I think that's been a real benefit, and I think a really positive message in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, that's really great. And I've actually heard some states recently are even bringing their utilities, their RFPs, before
Yes.
they issue them.
Yes.
In a way to say, here's our plan, here's what we're thinking about. And so the utilities can be really there in the ground floor.
Yeah.
as they start getting proposals and selecting the
And
projects.
let me add just a point on that, because we do engage at MDOT with our utilities, with our RFP processes.
That's great.
If it goes with EV chargers. And what I will say on that is that you get buy-in early, and it helps the uncertainty with an applicant on the utility process. It allows people to come together in a more thoughtful, strategic way, especially with limited resources and potentially limited areas on the grid that make sense for a deployment that people might be thinking about on their timeline. So I think that's a really great point, Rachel.
Amazing. Awesome. Okay, just a minute or two left. We're going to wrap up here with from each of your perspectives, what kind of incentive or program design features matter most for getting projects built and operational? So we heard from Ben a handful of those. Any more that you'd want to add? Or I've heard you already mention coordinated and streamlined really resonated with you. Anything else on Ben's list or otherwise that would be?
Yeah, I can name a couple. So one, there was an interesting take from the Maryland Trucking Association that the bulk of our fleets are under 10 trucks. So starting to even think about now the secondary market, what verification, used trucks, the proof of concept. So I think that was a place for some of our smaller fleets, which is the majority. Um, I think is a real opportunity starting to think about the secondary market. Another opportunity that I heard, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Alissa on some national examples, was the idea of a concierge service, bridging the gap between fleets, the utilities, to getting the manufacturers. It's complicated, it's sticky, it's just a lot. And as Alissa said, first and foremost, it gets hard. People are like, I'm out. And so that idea of a concierge truck electrification service, I think, is one that, I believe some other states have done, but what could be replicated? That seems to be a real opportunity in this space.
Yeah, happy to chat about that. I mean, I sort of think about, when you walk into an Apple store and it's really calm, and then there's immediately someone there to be like, how can I help you? I think we need something like this for kind of navigating buying this new technology, because it can be super intimidating. You want to make sure you're getting the incentive or the tax rebate, whatever it is. So, in states like Massachusetts, the Clean Energy Center, they have a fleet advisory program. New Jersey also, as part of their incentive program, have fleet advisory services. And in California, not only are there advisory services kind of within the utilities and statewide, but there's even an advisory service specific to the smaller fleets. So those mom and pop fleets that, don't have the level of staff that some of our multinational corporations do in terms of navigating the incentive process. And then, also figuring out how you're going to stack different things. In terms of program design, I think CalSTART, who's had decades of experience kind of in this space, there's really two things we think are going to get money out the door and more zero emission trucks on the road. One, when you're thinking about how that financial upfront kind of check is going to work, have it be an upfront voucher. So kind of cash on the hood, allow the dealer to process that for you. Oftentimes, we have companies that can't wait on getting their rebate. Obviously, something is better than nothing, but in terms of getting money out the door, that cash on the hood aspect of a rebate program is fantastic. The next thing is, to the extent possible, make scrappage optional. Some states were using VW funds through that settlement, and it required scrappage. And we saw millions of dollars sitting because, fleets just didn't have a vehicle to scrap. So I think as states are thinking about updating or creating their own programs, you want to keep that in mind. And then the last thing I'll say is, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, for example, just launched a pilot for funding, and it's just specific to Class 5 vehicles. And you know what? That's okay. You have to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. So I think the other takeaway here is, if you can't do every class, that is okay. Pick a class of vehicles that is working right now in terms of coming close to cost parity, or, depending on where you have your vehicles, non-attainment areas, but it doesn't have to be everything all at once. So that's another thing to consider. And I know I said that was the last thing, but this is the last thing. In Ben's overview, the sustained funding is so important. It's very hard for companies to buy into this technology if they think it's just going to be around for a hot second and then we're going to move on to something else. So I really think, zero emission vehicles are here to stay, and states need to be looking at those line items in their budgets for state agencies to be able to fund these types of programs year after year. So that was like 4 things, but there you go.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. Thank you, Alissa. I mean, what I'm hearing is that new markets and new technology, we're in the experimentation phase as we scale up and we figure out all the solutions. That's a major way of how we looked at it during my time in the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. Mm-hmm. And I think it's great. I mean, I remember sitting at conferences 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was just starting my career, and there was just so much conceptual discussion happening around electrification. Would it take off? Would it scale? What is the technology? What's going to be the winner in this market? And so for us to be like in the weeds, talking about very specific solutions, specific use cases, specific charging strategies, specific funding strategies, public and private dollars, I just think it's really exciting. So thank you so much, Morgan and Alissa, for taking the time to join us here today. It was a great conversation, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Rachel.